All rise! The command cracked through Municipal Courtroom 7B like a whip, but Sarah Collins wasn't there to hear it. She was sprinting up the courthouse steps, her heels clicking against marble, the weight of her federal prosecutor's badge heavy against her chest. 9:15 a.m. 15 minutes late. Through the heavy wooden doors, past security, down the echoing corridor. Her mind raced faster than her feet. The Thompson trafficking case, the biggest in Georgia's history, had demanded her immediate attention this morning. A last-minute defense motion that could derail months of work. Lives hung in the balance. She'd made her choice. Review the motion, save the case, be late to court. A simple parking ticket dispute could wait. Or so she thought. Sarah slowed at courtroom 7B's entrance, smoothing her navy blazer, squaring her shoulders. The moment she pushed open the door, she knew. The air itself felt hostile. Judge William Barrett's eyes locked onto her like heat-seeking missiles. His face, already flushed with authority, darkened at the sight of a young black woman daring to interrupt his proceedings. The other defendants, mostly white, mostly early, shifted in their wooden benches. They'd seen this before. Step forward, Barrett commanded, his voice dripping with the kind of disdain Sarah had encountered too many times in her career. She approached the podium, keeping her federal credentials hidden. Not yet. The judge hadn't even glanced at her paperwork, hadn't asked for an explanation. His assumptions were written all over his face. In this courtroom we have rules. Barrett began his lecture, shuffling papers without looking at her. This isn't some neighborhood gathering where you can just show up whenever you please. What Judge Barrett didn't know, as he prepared to make an example of her, was that his next words would trigger a chain of events that would expose decades of systemic bias in Atlanta's justice system. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon against prejudice is simply being in the wrong courtroom at the right time. Have you ever witnessed inequality in a place where justice should be blind? Share your story in the comments below. Sarah Collins never planned to become a catalyst for change in Atlanta's justice system. Her path to this moment began in the two-bedroom apartment where she grew up in southwest Atlanta, watching her mother work double shifts as a nurse to put her through school. Now, at 35, she lived in a sleek downtown high-rise, but she'd kept her mother's worn leather briefcase, a graduation gift from her days at Howard Law School, as a reminder of where she came from. Every morning followed the same precise routine. Up at 5:30 a.m., running shoes on, 6 miles through Piedmont Park as the city stirred to life. Back home by 7 o'clock, shower, then her favorite ritual, standing before the bathroom mirror, carefully maintaining her natural hair. After years of straightening it to look professional, she'd finally embraced her curls, despite the occasional raised eyebrows from older partners at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Her apartment reflected the duality of her life. Law books stacked precisely on mahogany shelves, case files organized with military precision, but African art from her travels adorned the walls, and a well-loved collection of jazz records sat beside her father's old turntable. He'd been a civil rights attorney in the 80s, fighting the same battles she still faced, just in different courtrooms. As Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, Sarah had earned a reputation for being methodical, unshakable, and devastatingly effective. Her colleagues nicknamed her the Closer, after she secured convictions in 3 consecutive human trafficking cases that other prosecutors had deemed unwinnable. But it was the current case, United States versus Thompson, that kept her up at night. The Thompson case represented everything she'd fought for: 72 victims, mostly young women of color, trafficked through Atlanta's bustling airport. The case had already exposed corruption in local law enforcement and links to prominent business figures. Sarah had spent 18 months building it, conducting interviews in safe houses, working with traumatized witnesses, piecing together financial records. She knew every detail, every victim's story, every paper trail. Her personal life had taken a back seat to her career, something her mother gently reminded her about during their weekly Sunday dinners. Dating was complicated when you spent most evenings reviewing case files or meeting with witnesses in witness protection. Her last relationship had ended 6 months ago when her boyfriend couldn't understand why she'd missed his birthday dinner to prep a trafficking survivor for testimony. The Mercedes in her reserved parking spot, her one real indulgence, often drew surprised looks from garage attendants who didn't expect to see a young black woman behind the wheel. She'd bought it after winning her first major case, ignoring colleagues who suggested something more practical. Sarah had learned early that in her world excellence wasn't just expected, it was barely enough. Her office on the 11th floor of the federal building had become a sanctuary. Photos of successful case teams lined one wall, but her favorite image sat on her desk, a group shot with survivors from her first trafficking case, now thriving in their new lives. Next to it stood a small plaque with her father's favorite quote: "Justice is not a destination but a constant journey." Few knew that she kept a detailed journal of every microaggression, every dismissive comment, every instance of being mistaken for a paralegal or court reporter. Not out of bitterness, but as documentation. Evidence. Her father had taught her that change requires both patience and proof. This morning should have been routine, a simple parking ticket dispute in municipal court. She'd chosen to dress more casually than usual. Navy blazer, cream blouse, tailored black pants, her power suits reserved for federal court. The ticket itself was minor, issued despite contradictory parking signs, but Sarah believed in addressing even small injustices. Every case, large or small, deserved the same attention to detail. What she couldn't know, as she rushed up those courthouse steps 15 minutes late, was that her entire career had been preparing her for this moment. Sometimes justice arrives not in landmark Supreme Court decisions or high-profile federal cases, but in small courtrooms on ordinary mornings when someone finally says, "Enough." Like Sarah, many legal professionals face daily challenges in their pursuit of justice. What sacrifices have you made in your career to stand up for what's right? The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Judge William Barrett's courtroom had a reputation for strict adherence to procedure, but those who frequented these halls knew there was more to the story. James Wilson, the bailiff who had served for 15 years, had seen the pattern too many times to count. He watched now as Sarah Collins stood before the bench, her composure unwavering despite the judge's obvious disdain. "Miss Collins," Barrett emphasized the miss with barely concealed condescension. "Perhaps in your community, time is a flexible concept. But in this courtroom, we operate on a schedule." He peered down from his elevated bench, wire-rimmed glasses catching the morning light. At 62, Barrett had presided over this courtroom for nearly 3 decades, his authority rarely challenged. Sarah noticed everything: the way he hadn't asked for her credentials, how his eyes skipped over her professional attire, the subtle shift in his tone that she'd learned to recognize since her first day at Howard Law. More importantly, she noticed what he wasn't seeing: the 7 other latecomers that morning, including 3 white attorneys who had slipped in quietly with nothing more than a nod from the bench. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, typed steadily at her computer, but her fingers hesitated slightly. In 12 years, she developed her own system of notes, documenting the disparities she witnessed daily but never felt empowered to challenge. Today's hearing was already raising red flags in her personal records. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the measured tone she'd perfected in federal court. "I apologize for my tardiness. If I may explain." "You may not," Barrett interrupted, shuffling papers he wasn't actually reading. "The time for explanations was 9 a.m. sharp. Now we'll address the matter of your contempt for this court's procedures." The gallery had grown unusually quiet. Among the spectators, a young law student frantically took notes, while a middle-aged white woman checked her watch, remembering she'd arrived 10 minutes late herself without comment. The patterns were becoming clear to everyone except, perhaps, the man in the black robe. Sarah's phone buzzed silently in her blazer pocket, likely an update on the Thompson case. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she stood here being lectured about tardiness, she was actually juggling one of the largest human trafficking cases in Georgia's history. But she remained still, documenting every word, every tone, every implicit bias in her mental notebook. This court, Barrett continued, warming to his role as disciplinarian, functions on respect. Without order, without punctuality, without proper deference to authority, we have chaos. He lifted his gavel, as if its mere presence would emphasize his point. Perhaps a financial lesson will help you better manage your time in the future. Sarah's hand moved subtly to her phone, activating its voice recorder. Years of prosecuting cases had taught her the value of documentation. Every word Barrett spoke was digging a deeper hole, one that would soon expose decades of systemic bias in Atlanta's municipal court system. The gallery had swelled as words spread through the courthouse about what was unfolding in 7B. Other attorneys, court staff, and even a few judges had quietly slipped in to witness the scene. Among them was Marcus Chin, a respected defense attorney who had faced Barrett numerous times. He leaned against the back wall, his expression grim as he recognized the familiar pattern playing out. $500, Barrett announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed they were teaching a valuable lesson. Payable before you leave the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you to be late with that as well. A few nervous laughs from the gallery died quickly in the tense air. Mrs. Thompson's fingers froze over her keyboard. $500 for being 15 minutes late? The standard fine, when rarely applied, was $50. She glanced at her personal log, where she documented every contempt charge for the past year. The pattern was startling: higher fines, harsher tone, stricter enforcement, all correlating with the defendant's race and perceived status. Sarah stood perfectly still, her legal mind cataloging every procedural violation, every disparate treatment, every abuse of discretion. She thought of the Thompson case files waiting on her desk upstairs in the federal building, of the victims who trusted her to fight for justice. Sometimes, she realized, justice needed to be fought for on unexpected battlegrounds. Do you understand the fine as I've explained it? Barrett asked, already reaching for the next case file, assuming the matter was settled. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her voice clear and steady. I understand completely. Each word was carefully chosen, laden with meaning that Barrett had yet to grasp. She reached slowly for her briefcase, not toward her checkbook, but toward the leather credential holder bearing the gold seal of the United States Department of Justice. The morning sun had shifted now, illuminating Sarah's face as she stood at the podium. In the gallery, James Wilson moved slightly closer, recognizing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Mrs. Thompson's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to document what she somehow knew would be a historic moment in this courtroom. Barrett had already started to turn his attention to the next case when Sarah's voice cut through the air, carrying a new authority that made everyone in the courtroom pause. Your Honor, before we proceed, I believe it's important to establish something for the record. The next few moments would shatter the carefully maintained veneer of Judge William Barrett's courtroom, exposing the structural inequities that had festered unchallenged for decades. Sometimes, justice arrives not with a bang but with the quiet opening of a federal prosecutor's credentials in a municipal courtroom on an ordinary Monday morning. Pause for a moment. What would you do if you were in Sarah's position? Would you risk your professional comfort to challenge systemic bias? Let us know your thoughts below. Sarah's credentials caught the morning light as she held them up, the gold Department of Justice seal gleaming like a sudden sunrise in the municipal courtroom. Your Honor, I am Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins, Northern District of Georgia. Her voice carried the weight of federal authority, filling every corner of courtroom 7B. The effect was immediate and electric. Judge Barrett's face, which had been flushed with authority moments before, drained of color. His hand, still reaching for the next case file, froze mid-motion. In the gallery, the young law student's pen clattered to the floor, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. I apologize for my tardiness this morning, Sarah continued, her tone professional but pointed. I was delayed by an urgent matter in the Thompson human trafficking case, currently the largest trafficking prosecution in Georgia's history. She placed her credentials on the podium with deliberate care. I have written confirmation of this morning's emergency from the U.S. Attorney himself, if the court requires it. Mrs. Thompson's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word. In 15 years of court reporting, she'd never seen anything quite like this. Judge Barrett's mouth opened and closed twice before he found his voice. That is... Attorney Collins, he stumbled, suddenly unsure of his footing on the familiar ground of his own courtroom. Had I known your position... That's precisely the point, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm but measured. My position shouldn't matter. Neither should my race, gender, or appearance. She gestured to her phone, still recording. What matters is the equal application of justice. In the past hour, I've observed 7 late arrivals to your courtroom. 3 white attorneys received no comment. 2 Asian students received verbal warnings. And 2 black individuals, myself included, received the harshest treatment and unprecedented fines. The gallery erupted in whispers. Marcus Chin, still watching from the back wall, pulled out his own phone and began taking notes. He'd lost cases in this courtroom that had never felt quite right. Now he understood why. This is highly irregular, Barrett managed, his authority crumbling visibly. Perhaps we should discuss this in chambers. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied firmly. This needs to be on the record. She pulled out her phone, displaying a spreadsheet. I've documented every interaction in this courtroom since I arrived. Times, races, responses, fines. The pattern is clear and deeply troubling. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood straighter, his chest tight with emotion. How many times had he watched this same scene play out, but with defendants who lacked Sarah's position and power? He caught her eye briefly, giving her a subtle nod of support. The fine, Barrett said quickly, shuffling papers with trembling hands. Consider it dismissed. A misunderstanding. Again, Your Honor, that's not the point. Sarah's voice took on the sharp edge she usually reserved for closing arguments in federal court. Dismissing my fine because of my position only reinforces the systemic bias I'm addressing. I intend to pay the fine, all $500, specifically so it can serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings. She turned slightly, addressing the entire courtroom. This isn't about a fine. This is about a pattern of behavior that undermines the very foundation of justice. Every person who walks into this courtroom deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of their title, appearance, or background. The young law student had recovered her pen and was now recording every word, instinctively understanding she was witnessing something historic. In the front row, an elderly black man wiped tears from his eyes, remembering his own experiences in this very courtroom decades ago. Attorney Collins, Barrett tried again, his voice notably softer. Surely we can resolve this matter professionally. We are resolving it professionally, Your Honor, Sarah responded, her tone unwavering. I've already submitted a detailed report to the Judicial Qualifications Commission. My office will be requesting a comprehensive review of your contempt charges, fines, and sentencing patterns over the past 5 years. The morning sun now filled the courtroom completely, harsh and revealing, like truth itself. Mrs. Thompson's personal log lay open beside her keyboard, years of documented disparities finally finding their moment of relevance. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I'm formally requesting an investigation into systemic bias across all municipal courts in Atlanta. This isn't just about today, or this courtroom, or even you, Judge Barrett. This is about ensuring that justice truly is blind. Barrett sat back in his chair, the weight of 3 decades of unchecked bias finally settling on his shoulders. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and everyone in courtroom 7B knew it. What had begun as a simple parking ticket dispute had transformed into a moment of reckoning for Atlanta's entire judicial system. Sarah reached for her checkbook, her movements deliberate and measured. I'll pay the fine now, Your Honor. Every penny will serve as evidence in what comes next. Her voice carried both promise and warning. Because what comes next, Your Honor, is change. By late afternoon, the tremors from courtroom 7B had spread to Atlanta's legal community like aftershocks from an earthquake. Sarah sat in her federal office, reviewing documents for the Thompson case, when her phone started buzzing with messages from across the city. The truth, it seemed, had been waiting for someone with the power to speak it. "You did what we couldn't," read a text from Marcus Chin. Attached was a spreadsheet, 3 years of documented disparities in Barrett's sentencing patterns that defense attorneys had tracked but never had the leverage to challenge. "We've been collecting data, waiting for the right moment." Down in the municipal court's filing office, Mrs. Thompson had quietly begun pulling records. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the drawer containing her personal logbook. For 12 years, she documented every concerning incident, dates, times, racial patterns, disparate finds. She'd kept this record secret, afraid of losing her job. Now, she placed it on the copy machine. "It's all here," she told the Judicial Review Board investigator who had appeared with surprising speed. "Every fine, every contempt charge, every attitude adjustment sentence." Her voice cracked slightly. "I just didn't know what to do with it all." The courthouse grapevine hummed with activity. Other judges, sensing the shifting wind, suddenly found themselves reviewing their own patterns of behavior. In Judge Barrett's now empty chambers, his clerk discovered something telling, a drawer full of statistical reports on sentencing patterns that the judge had repeatedly ignored. Sarah's phone rang again. Sharon Martinez, president of the Atlanta Black Lawyers Association. "We've been documenting these patterns for years," Sharon explained, her voice urgent. "But coming from a federal prosecutor, especially one who experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. Would you be willing to speak at our next meeting?" In the courthouse cafeteria, James Wilson sat with other bailiffs, finally sharing stories they'd kept quiet for years. "Remember last summer?" one asked. "That white corporate lawyer who cursed at the judge. Got a warning. Next day, young brother in a hoodie shows up 1 minute late, 3 days for contempt." Sarah's revelation had done more than expose one judge's bias. It had cracked open a dam of silence. Court reporters compared notes across departments. Defense attorneys traded stories of suspicious patterns. Even parking attendants had stories of watching differently dressed defendants receive wildly different treatment. At her desk, Sarah opened her email to find messages from across the country. Other federal prosecutors sharing similar experiences. Law professors requesting case details for their curricula. Civil rights organizations offering support and resources. But it was the email from Judge Barrett himself that made her pause. Sent through his clerk, it attempted to smooth over the morning's events. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately, find a professional resolution." Sarah's response was simple. "Your Honor, this stopped being private the moment it became systemic. Professional resolution requires public accountability." By evening, local news vans had gathered outside the courthouse. The story was too powerful to ignore. A federal prosecutor, mistaken for just another defendant, had exposed decades of documented bias. But the real story wasn't in front of the cameras. It was in the quiet conversations happening in law offices, courthouse corridors, and judicial chambers across Atlanta. Mrs. Thompson had just finished copying her logbook when her phone lit up with messages from other court clerks. They had records too. Notes. Observations. Documentation that had been waiting for this moment. In the federal building, Sarah received one final visitor, the elderly black man who had witnessed everything that morning. He introduced himself as Reverend James Matthews, a civil rights activist who'd been watching Barrett's courtroom for years. 30 years ago, he said softly, I sat in that same courtroom, watching the same patterns. But nobody with power was willing to see it. He placed a worn notebook on her desk. I've been keeping records too. Maybe now someone will finally read them. Sarah looked at her own case notes from that morning, then at Reverend Matthews' decades of documentation. Sometimes power wasn't just about having authority. It was about being in a position to give voice to those who had been silenced. The sun was setting over Atlanta as Sarah finally gathered her things to leave. Tomorrow would bring investigations, media inquiries, and the hard work of systemic change. But tonight she thought about all those quiet record-keepers, the Mrs. Thompsons and Reverend Matthews of the world, who had been waiting for someone who could turn their documentation into action. The truth had always been there. It just needed someone with the right kind of power to speak it out loud. 1 week after the confrontation in Courtroom 7B, the State Judicial Qualifications Commission launched their most extensive investigation in a decade. Linda Martinez, the lead investigator with 20 years of experience, spread dozens of files across the conference room table on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building. "Look at these numbers," she told her team, pointing to a spreadsheet compiled from Mrs. Thompson's logs. "Traffic violations. Average fine for black defendants, $450. White defendants, $150. Same offenses, same court, same judge." She pushed her glasses up and sighed. And that's just the beginning. The investigation had quickly grown beyond Judge Barrett's courtroom. Other court clerks had come forward with their own records, creating a pattern that spanned multiple courtrooms and decades. The team had to request additional analysts just to process the flood of data. "It's not just the fines," explained James Wilson, testifying before the commission. "It's how long people got to speak. Who got payment plans approved? Which cases got dismissed before evidence was even presented?" He handed over his own notebook, years of careful observations documented in precise handwriting. "Some days I'd count how many times the judge interrupted different defendants. The patterns were impossible to miss." Sarah's federal office had become an unofficial command center for the investigation. Defense attorneys streamed in with case files, civil rights organizations provided historical context, and data analysts volunteered to help process the growing mountain of evidence. "We found something interesting," said Michaelchin, a data scientist working pro bono. He pulled up a visualization on his laptop. "When we mapped courthouse parking assignments against case outcomes, even that showed bias. Premium spots were consistently reserved for white attorneys, while others had to park blocks away, often leading to tardiness and subsequent penalties." The media had latched onto the story, but not just for its shocking revelations. Channel 5's Evening News ran a special series titled "Justice Delayed," featuring interviews with former defendants who had faced similar treatment. "I lost my job because of those fines," one woman testified, her voice shaking. "Couldn't pay, got more fines for late payment, ended up with a warrant. All from a broken taillight that white drivers got warnings for." The investigation uncovered more troubling patterns. Cases involving minority defendants averaged 40% less time in court. Payment plan requests were denied 3 times more often for minorities. Character witnesses for minority defendants were interrupted more frequently. Cases with white defendants were 60% more likely to be dismissed for insufficient evidence. Sarah worked late into the night, coordinating with investigators while still managing her federal caseload. The Thompson trafficking case remained her priority, but she recognized that these systemic issues were connected. Bias in one part of the justice system affected all others. "We're seeing similar patterns in other districts," reported Sharon Martinez during a conference call with investigators. "Atlanta's not unique, we're just the first to get hard data on it." The investigation had expanded to include court transcripts from the past 5 years, security footage showing different treatment of defendants, financial records of fine payments and consequences, staff complaints that had been buried or ignored, parking citation patterns around the courthouse, audio recordings of judges' comments during proceedings. Judge Barrett had initially resisted cooperating, but as evidence mounted, his position weakened. His own clerk had turned over emails showing he'd been warned about bias in his sentencing patterns, but had dismissed the concerns. "I never thought," he began during his interview with the commission, then stopped. The data on his own behavior had finally forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. The investigation's preliminary findings made national news. Other jurisdictions began launching their own reviews, recognizing that Atlanta's story might be their story too. "This isn't just about bad judges," Sarah explained to a committee of legal observers. "It's about systems that enable bias to flourish unchecked. Every dismissed complaint, every ignored pattern, every silent witness, they're all part of the problem. As the sun set over Atlanta's skyline, Linda Martinez added one more file to her growing collection, a thick binder of letters from citizens sharing their courthouse experiences. The investigation had become more than a review of one judge or one court. It was revealing how justice in America still bent differently for different people. The numbers tell the story, she told her team. But it's the people behind those numbers who deserve our attention. This isn't just about data, it's about dignity. 3 months after Sarah Collins walked into Judge Barrett's courtroom, the face of justice in Atlanta had begun to transform. Workers installed a new sign above the main courthouse entrance. Center for Judicial Education and Equality. Inside, the changes went far deeper than news signage. Judge Barrett had resigned rather than face a public hearing, but his departure marked a beginning, not an end. In an unexpected turn, he'd become part of the solution, speaking at judicial training sessions about unconscious bias. "I never saw it," he told a room full of judges, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "For 30 years, I thought being fair meant treating everyone the same way. I never examined how my own background and assumptions affected my decisions." He gestured to Sarah, who sat in the back of the room. "It took someone with the courage to stand up and the power to be heard to make me see what had been in front of me all along." The reforms spread through the system like ripples in a pond. Mandatory monthly reviews of judicial decisions for racial disparities. Anonymous reporting systems for court staff to flag concerning patterns. Community oversight committees with real power to investigate complaints. Standardized fine structures with clear guidelines for exceptions. Regular bias training for all court personnel, from judges to security staff. Mrs. Thompson, the former court clerk who had documented years of bias, now headed a new court monitoring program. Her personal logbook had become required reading at judicial training sessions. "We're the eyes and ears of the courthouse," she told her first class of court monitors. "Our job isn't just to observe anymore, it's to speak up when we see unfairness." The changes reached beyond Atlanta. Other jurisdictions began implementing similar reforms, recognizing that what happened in courtroom 7B could have happened anywhere. The Atlanta model of judicial accountability became a template for courts nationwide. Sarah's federal office had transformed too. The framed $500 fine receipt hung on her wall, surrounding by photographs of community meetings and training sessions. Below it sat a growing stack of letters from people sharing their own stories of standing up to systemic bias. "It's not just about punishing bad behavior," she explained to a group of law students during a guest lecture. "It's about changing the way we think about justice. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of their race, gender, or background." The statistics told a compelling story of change. Racial disparities in fines decreased by 85% in the first quarter. Successful appeals of biased decisions increased by 200%. Community trust in the court system showed meaningful improvement. More diverse candidates began applying for judicial positions. Court satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements across all demographics. James Wilson, the bailiff who had witnessed decades of inequality, now led courthouse security training. "We don't just protect the physical safety of the court anymore," he told new officers. "We protect its integrity too." But perhaps the most significant change was the shift in institutional culture. Court employees no longer felt they had to stay silent about bias. Judges actively sought feedback on their decision-making patterns. The courthouse had transformed from a place where power flowed one way to a community where justice was a shared responsibility. One morning, exactly 3 months after the incident, Sarah received a letter. It was from the young law student who had witnessed everything that day in court. She wrote about how that moment had changed her career path. She was now focusing on civil rights law. "You showed me that change is possible," the letter read. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say this isn't right." The student had started a legal clinic at her law school to help people who face discrimination in court. In the main courthouse lobby, a new plaque had been installed. Justice is not just about the law. It's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors. True justice requires courage, the courage to speak up, the courage to listen, and the courage to change. Below these words was the day Sarah Collins walked into Judge Barrett's courtroom and changed everything. As Sarah prepared for another day in federal court, she thought about all the Mrs. Thompsons and James Wilsons out there, still quietly documenting injustice, still waiting for their moment to speak. The system hadn't been fixed entirely. Change never happens overnight. But now there was a path forward, a way to challenge bias that didn't require extraordinary circumstances or federal credentials. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful form of justice isn't found in landmark Supreme Court decisions or dramatic courtroom confrontations. Sometimes it's found in the quiet courage of people who refuse to accept that that's just how things are, who dare to imagine that the system can be better, and who are willing to stand up and make it so. Sarah's story isn't unique, it's happening in courtrooms across America right now. Here's how you can make a difference. Subscribe and share. Hit subscribe to follow our ongoing investigation into judicial bias. Share this video with 3 legal professionals you know. Enable notifications to join our live discussions with experts. Join the conversation. Comment with your own courtroom experiences. Participate in our weekly #JusticeTalks Twitter Spaces. Submit your story for our upcoming documentary series. Take action locally. Find your local court monitoring program. Request bias training in your institution. Document and report disparities in your community. Remember, change doesn't require federal credentials, it requires courage and community. Join us in making justice truly blind, one courtroom at a time.